Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Off the Shelf, and today we're going to be talking about this book, To Kill a Kingdom by Alexander Christo. This book is a retelling of The Little Mermaid, where the Little Mermaid is trying to kill the prince. The main character, Lyra, is Siren royalty, and due to disobeying her mother, she is cursed to be human, which she understandably hates. And the prince is a ruthless siren hunter who is killing the siren because they keep killing the princes and princesses and various royalty of the human kingdoms. So this book got really big on TikTok, as you can tell by the little sticker, which I have to admit I don't really like on the cover, as I think this cover is fairly... If I had seen it, I probably would not have bought it if I hadn't already heard about it. And I'm going to have to be honest, there are books that get big on TikTok, you can understand why. For example, We Hunt the Flame, or Six of Crows, but this, it was sold on Pretty Images, that users had complied to put a montage on and various lines that were taken out of context. So my first thoughts, it was too long and too short. So whilst there is a nice plot progression of the various characters moving around, sailing from this place to another place, I would say the story itself came across as somewhat plain. Whilst the visuals described are very good, if somewhat predictable, I would argue that the aesthetic used for the book didn't really make much sense. So it was billed as a sort of Pirates of the Caribbean type feeling, and that the prince was a pirate. And whilst he certainly uses pirate imagery, and he is planning on stealing from the other kingdoms to gain objects that will allow him to kill the siren, I have to admit that doesn't actually make sense. Because he's just a sailor who's doing a deed that the kingdom wants him to do. Whereas a pirate is often actively rebelling against authority, some kind of authority figure, and sometimes that can be sympathetic. For example, in the pirate media, Black Sails, it's very much about the horrors, from what I've heard, of British imperialism, and that's highlighted how these various people have seen British imperialism and thus want to create something else. Apologies if I get this wrong. Well, in this book, the pirate aesthetic was sure. These characters do wish to go against the wishes of their parents, but it's like not particularly meaningful way, because they themselves are monarchs, and it's very pro-monarchy. The idea of the monarchy isn't questioned. And for me, that is somewhat questionable. As I should probably note, with Britain we have a monarchy, and recent events have certainly highlighted that they are actually very corrupt in doing so, and that was dealt with badly. So if you thought they were arguing against the idea of authority, why don't they rebel against this idea that they should be forced into roles they don't want? And one topic, because this book is the enemies to lovers trope, which is something I actually like. For me, it was just their relationship was, well, the first few chapters were well set out. Like, there's this killing of various species, and we see how sirens melt into the water from Elian's prow, and how from Lyra's prow she steals their hearts, then sings them to drown, and they just float down, which was really evocative, which makes this book all the more disappointing, because I would say their romance just seems to rely on the idea of banter. I read all of it and I just can't seem to recall them bonding. And the world building, sure, there's a kingdom that's with ice and snow high up in the mountains next to a lake. There's a kingdom of romance and song, and one that's literally bathed in gold. But it just comes across as uninteresting, because we don't see how this affects the characters. And the Siren Kingdom, I have no visually speaking, I have no idea on how to describe it in a sense, because Lyra's family background and the relationship she has with her cousin, who her aunt was killed, is one of the most interesting parts of the book. The Siren Queen is an abusive woman who forced Lyra to essentially be a child soldier, kill or be killed. And that made her into the cold-hearted person she is in the narrative. And her narrative journey through falling in love with someone she was supposed to consider an enemy made her realise what she did was both fucked up, and made her decide that she, instead of needing to impress her mother, she had to kill her mother, which is fair enough, I guess. It's just a very heavy storyline, and there aren't really any moments of heaviness. Whilst there's lots of wax lyrical sounding words that she uses from this character's point of view, her character transition didn't feel meaningful. It felt flat. And she allows her cousin to die to maintain her charade. And yeah, she does feel awful, but that image doesn't haunt her. And some of the mythology hinted is really... It sounds a bit trite, but it is engaging. And it doesn't really look at how propaganda might affect. Because they realise by hanging out with each other, hey, maybe our two countries shouldn't kill each other. And at the very least, one thing I will note though, is both of these characters are set to an equal playing field. However, Lyra, she joins this guy on his pirate ship, which doesn't really make sense, and it does show them bonding through them helping him steal various things from other monarchs, other people, and there is no reflection on the morality of that. And obviously the idea of an arranged marriage comes up. And this is where I would argue in the narrative things go from unengaging to uncomfortable. So the woman who's teased as marrying her, who's marrying Elian, is called Yukio. And this feels uncomfortable because she's set up as this cold political rival who wants a kingdom. And because her family already has a succession, through the fact she has older brothers, at the very end, it's just kind of... I can't actually recall if she lives or dies. Oh yes, I think I gave up here, because it was just so uninteresting. I remember, and it's very much... a case of... She's not a love rival, but it's very much sort of a page homage to the Little Mermaid story. However, she isn't shown to be likable, or even just... It's an uncomfortable read because Lyra is very much shown to be pale and thus, white. but the person who would be in opposition to her from having the happy ending that's very quickly teased and sort of forgotten is an Asian woman, more specifically I think Japanese, as the story doesn't go very in depth on anything, as I also have another character from the same region who mentioned being called Sakura. So I think she's meant to be from the equivalent culture of being Japanese. So it is a somewhat uncomfortable moment, and so I would also argue the side characters are very one note. They very much seem to serve to show Lyra's development into being a better person and show that the prince isn't that bad of a guy. And yeah, so I think this one was meant to be diverse, but doesn't do that very well. And it's just like, there's also another thing that bothers me is it's a retelling of The Little Mermaid. And the central theme of The Little Mermaid is unrequited love. So the outer fiction reason is because Hans Christian Andersen today is very much understood to be a queer man who was living during a time period where such things were hard to express openly. His exact sexuality is unknown, but many think had he known about today's terminology, he would have described himself as bisexual. At the very least, and The Little Mermaid was built about his longing for a friend who he couldn't be with. He himself never actually engaged in any kind of relationship. He just longed for his friends, and even when he visited prostitutes, he would simply, no kind of penetration or anything any touching would occur. He would simply ask to look at their bodies, and he felt ashamed and he built a guilt complex. I think. I wouldn't ask, do not quote me there. Do the research yourselves. So often a central theme is how do you deal with unrequited love, and that often leads into it being a morality tale, as it's very much a case of The Little Mermaid. The reason she's shown to be a moral figure is because she has a way of solving her curse, of returning to her home in the sea and essentially being able to live. She chooses not to stab the princess her prince marries, so she ascends to the heavens. And thus, because of this, she gains a soul, or becomes her soul, her essence, become a ghost floating in the heavens. It's been a while since I read something that was in a summary of it. So, and that story, how do you deal with curses and the morality, from what I remember, is kind of a point. There is no point where she thinks her love is unrequited. There is no point where any kind of morality is looked at. It's just filled with pretty meandering scenes. And whilst the grammar wasn't atrocious, and to be honest, as far as bad YA love stories go, this is, well, it's a lot better than, say, something like A Court of Thorns and Rose series, or Twilight, or anything like that. But at the same time, I would not recommend this book, and I would say it's off the shelf because it's just boring and bad.